ClearFlame has the potential to be the Tesla of heavy duty. What made Tesla Tesla wasn't that they were just making an EV. It was that they saw a market need that the traditional incumbents did not and went out and they met that market need. The next Tesla actually is the company that is figuring out what's around the next corner. That's ClearFlame. And like 10 years from now, everyone's going to be talking about using decarbonized liquid fuels in heavy applications because ClearFlame proved it was possible, just like everyone's talking about using EVs today because Tesla proved it was possible.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. Sometimes, innovation or discovery comes out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning from the clear blue sky that no one, not even the inventor, saw coming. We love stories of these unexpected paradigm shifts, the original eureka moment, like Archimedes running naked through the streets of Syracuse in excitement at discovering water displacement, or Auguste Kekulé dreaming of a snake eating its tail and discovering the structure of benzene. Edison shocking the editors of Scientific American with a machine that could play back the recorded sounds. Or two bicycle-making brothers disappearing into the wild of North Carolina and building a machine that unlocked humanity's dream of flight. The stories are exciting, they're fun, they're motivating. They encourage us to stay open to big thinking and thinking outside the box. They remind us just how quickly the world can change in big, profound ways. But just as important as these sudden revolutions are the incremental technological evolutions that take existing ideas and improve upon them, iteration by iteration, until suddenly they're making an outsized impact. It reminds me of one of my favorite pieces of advice my dad shared on the podcast last week. Talk to other people in your industry and learn what they're doing, what mistakes they've made, so you can stand on their shoulders when you're doing your own work. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to make a big difference. And make no mistake, little improvements on existing systems can end up unlocking massive changes. Johannes Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press out of whole cloth. Many of its components already existed. The screw press had been around since ancient Rome. Movable type went all the way back to 11th century China. Gutenberg's unique contribution was actually something small, a special lead alloy and molding process that made casting type pieces much easier. But that little improvement, when added to the combination of those other big pieces into a singular process, is what created a machine that completely changed the world. It's exactly the same kind of seemingly small, but potentially super impactful improvement that's at the heart of the work my guest today is doing. BJ Johnson is the co-founder and CEO of ClearFlame, a clean tech startup that is creating an accelerated path to sustainable heavy-duty transportation by modifying diesel engines to run on decarbonized fuels. It's an idea so awesomely simple and win-win, an engine mod that lets companies cut their carbon footprint in half without needing to replace fleets or install charging infrastructure, that it seems completely obvious in retrospect, which is always the hallmark of a great idea, and the reason I knew we had to get BJ to join us on the podcast. In addition to being a 3-time Stanford grad in undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral degrees, BJ is also a literal world-class athlete, having competed for the U.S. national swim team at the World Championships in 2013 and 2014, while he was doing the doctoral work that would lead to ClearFlame. Obviously, he is an incredibly impressive guy. But what inspires me most is his true commitment to following the path that will make the biggest positive impact in the least amount of time, which may be something he picked up from all those swim meets. We're about to find out. Let's jump right in. And no pun intended. Let's start with an easy question. Go back to the very beginning and tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you were raised.
So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, went to Garfield High School, very proud of that. I did my undergrad and grad at Stanford in California, which is where I initially developed the technology that became ClearFlame. And now I'm based in the Midwest, Chicago area, where my mom's family's from originally.
And you always had like an academic penchant for engineering and even energy from, it seems like, an early age. So I'm curious when that interest developed, or if you can pinpoint how that passion got started.
I think the passion for, and I wouldn't even put it as engineering, I'd call it physics. The passion for physics kind of developed in high school when I took my first physics intro course. And you were doing the little experiments in class where, you'd shoot a Nerf gun at a falling ball and calculate when they hit each other and stuff like that. And it blew my 17, 18-year-old mind that you could actually describe the world in these things that you see every day in numbers and equations.
Yeah.
And actually very simple numbers and equations.
Yeah.
And so that was really a big point of passion for me. I think that became engineering in college. when engineering became kind of the applied, let's solve real world problems version of physics. And I think the emphasis on climate, this was around when Inconvenient Truth came out. And it was very clear that, climate change was going to be the generational problem of my generation and unfortunately generations to come.
Yeah.
That really became a way to focus that passion for engineering on a real world problem that I cared about a lot.
And you talk about education. You stuck around a single place for your educational career. You were at Stanford, undergrad, grad, and doctoral work. And I'm curious, what was it that drew you to Stanford in the first place? And then what kept you there? The gravitational pull.
Yeah. What drew me there, so I was a competitive swimmer for a very long time, growing up in college and actually post-grad as well. I was lucky enough to swim on the U.S. national team for a few years in there. Stanford's one of the really good engineering programs, really good schools out there that also happens to have a really good swim program and athletic department. So that was really a place that I could do both. When it came to staying there for grad school, definitely a very hard decision. Like you said, it's not the norm. If anything, there's a little bit of a stigma to staying at one place. But I think I was just comfortable there. And I wanted to continue with where I was comfortable and where I was learning and growing. And obviously that worked out really well in hindsight, because it actually wasn't until grad school that I met my thesis advisor, who became the professor for myself and my co-founder, Julie Bloomreiter, for the technology that became ClearFlame. So I didn't stay at Stanford to do ClearFlame, but obviously ClearFlame would not have happened if I had not stayed at Stanford. So that was quite fortuitous.
It helps that it is, I would argue, probably one of the most beautiful campuses in America.
Yeah, I usually say it's a resort where there's classes sometimes.
I love it there. We've talked to a ton of Stanford alums, and it does seem like there's a culture that really fosters an affinity for entrepreneurship. And, I think the easy answer is that it's proximity to Silicon Valley, but I'm curious if you see something more fundamental that connects the students that you knew or know from Stanford with that entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, it's definitely tied to the proximity to Silicon Valley, but it's not like it's some sort of like osmosis of opportunity or something like that. No, I think it's actually the culture that comes in the region. And we're starting to see this other places in the country now, but it was not true 10, 15 years ago, certainly not before that, of the stigma of entrepreneurship. It is something where you are more likely than not to fail. That is reality.
Right.
But it is not only comfort with the fact that that is the risk you're getting into, but also there's a little bit of like a red badge of courage thing that goes on with like failure actually being a point of pride. Like that kind of first failure that you have is what sets you up for a lot of your big successes to come, because you learn as much from failing as you do from succeeding. Many people would argue actually learn more from failing. And I think that's very baked into the culture. It's like, well, if you want to learn and grow as quickly as you can, why not try entrepreneurship? The worst thing that happens is that you fail. And that worst thing is actually one of the best growth experiences you can have. And that's just very baked into the world there. And it's also not just the business school, it's true at the engineering level. Engineers can be good business people. It's a lot of the same fundamentals. And so this notion of, you have to go to business school to start a company, I brought that up with an early investor and they said, BJ, a Ph.D. is a terminal degree for a reason, like you don't get another one. But the fact that it's available to everyone, not just MBAs, is also an important part of what comes from there.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the idea of failure as a point of pride, especially I think, a lot of folks that I know, undergraduates from Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, failure is not a normal thing for a lot of us. And I think a lot of people struggle with that concept. So I'm wondering, when you began to recognize failure as an opportunity versus fear failure in a way that a lot of kind of high achieving winners in sports / elite students have that kind of that visceral fear of failure. When did that change for you?
A visceral fear of failure is not a good thing because, fear is the mind killer, to use a favorite book of mine. Now, hatred of failure, I think that's very important. I think it's a huge motivator. One of the swim coaches I knew actually said this, that, they felt excitement of a success versus hatred of failure. Like most of the really successful people he meets are actually the latter. They're like, winning, yeah, that's cool, but like it's mostly because I didn't lose. That's why I like it. That was something that I think really being in athletics and academics at the same time, and frankly, having a lot of athletic experience before starting Stanford, helped me a lot. In swimming, there's literally one winner and everyone else is a loser.
Right.
So that's not to say that, there's shame in it or anything, but you just get very used to everything you are doing. There's one good outcome and then a whole series of ones that are suboptimal. And that is the game you're playing. It's what you're signing up for. And if you're afraid of it, it's crippling. If you hate it, you'll do everything you can to avoid it. That mindset of I'm going to do whatever I can under my control to avoid that outcome. But then there are things that are out of my control and I have to be comfortable with that too. That translates from sport very well to entrepreneurship.
We've also had a ton of athletes. There's very clearly some connection between athletics and the entrepreneur's journey. But it is interesting. I think your athletic career, was at a very elite level, swimming for the national team. But also, I think of swimmers as, start their training at age 3 and are doing it every summer, all summer from 4 a.m. until 10 p.m., from age 3 on. And you did start swimming a little later in your life. So what did you take away from that period, and kind of talk to us a little bit about that journey too?
Yeah, so I didn't really start competitive year-round swimming until I was 16. I grew up in Seattle, like I said, and everyone growing up in Seattle learns how to swim for safety, if nothing else. But, swimming competitively was something I really did a little bit when I was younger. Really in high school is when I kind of started doing it. And it was around the time I was starting to make the college decision. I was looking to go to Stanford. I was like, there's actually improvement that I have to have in my capabilities here to even actually make it onto a team. And I only walked onto that team. I was not a scholarship athlete, and yet ended up in a very good place after it all. I think in starting it late, you're right. A lot of people start early. It's really hard. It's really brutal on young kids, particularly when there's too much pressure on them too early. And so I was lucky enough to not have that pressure. And I think that's what allowed me to keep swimming until I was 27, 28, something like that. I went from being an undergraduate student athlete to basically being just a graduate student athlete. I was still doing both at the same time. And I had that luxury because I did have 6 more years of school beyond senior year in college.
Right. I mean, that's interesting because all this, your entrepreneur's journey, your competitive swimming kind of at the most elite levels, your doctoral work is all colliding around the same time in life. How did you juggle and balance, and how did those journeys complement one another?
Yeah, I think it is one of the things that does help about, you said there's a lot of athletes that become entrepreneurs. There's a lot of discipline that has to come with it, particularly when it's on the student athlete side, because you are having to constantly manage 2 things at once. There are parts about it that are really hard, and I've missed some phases of my life that I wish I didn't have to miss. But my time off from school was the couple weeks I'd carve out for the really critical summer swim meets, nationals or world. And after those big swim meets, I didn't get time off to have fun because that's when I had to go back and make sure my Ph.D. work got up to speed. But that is something that has translated really well to my work at ClearFlame, particularly in the CEO role, because, I'm ultimately responsible for everyone's paycheck at the company and making sure that the company continues to grow and thrive. And that there's something that needs to be done to keep that going, or to move that back in the right direction, or fix whatever problem inevitably happens. That's just something that's sort of baked in, like it or not. This is what you've committed to, and this is what you got to deal with. And fortunately, it is a lot more like it than not, but that doesn't matter. It is your responsibility, and you have the discipline to address it.
So let's get back to your time at school on the academic side. I'm curious to hear what your studies looked like, knowing that that's going to kind of inform the business that you built. But I also want to know when, as a student, you started to actually understand or think about the role of an entrepreneur as a potential outcome, versus a PhD, where a lot of folks end up in academia or research. So talk to us about kind of your academic journey specifically.
Yeah. So I mentioned Chris Edwards, the professor who became my thesis advisor. He teaches the graduate energy sequence in mechanical engineering at Stanford. And kind of the initial kernel that formed this broader thesis was he always talks about there being 2 sides of the energy problem. Yes, we have to achieve sustainability. We're emitting too much carbon, 40 gigatons, of which 5% are coming from things like diesel engines. We have to solve that, but at the same time, there's another problem that there's still about 900 million people in the world that don't have access to basic electricity. There's very little that is more correlated with improving quality of life than improving energy access, and particularly in the global south. So if we are serious about getting everyone to the kind of standard of living that we enjoy, in the US or in Europe, which should be the goal. If not, I don't understand why we're doing this. You have to expand energy access. You have to double energy consumption while simultaneously making it renewable. And then that kind of training as an energy person became focused on engines, because engines ultimately are an energy conversion device. And there's nothing wrong about the diesel engine. It's about as efficient as the automotive fuel cell. The problem with the diesel engine is always the fuels that were used in it. And so what was my PhD research was showing that you could modify a diesel engine to be able to use these much more globally scalable, low carbon liquid fuels than the other solutions that are being considered today. And what that lets you do is allow the diesel engine to keep filling these vital economic functions that improve people's quality of life, but decoupled from the challenge of climate change. Now, when did that actually become a company and an entrepreneurial journey?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, because I made that sound like I had all sorts of foresight capabilities, which I did not. There was another set of students ahead of me, Matt and Shannon and Adam, at a company now called Mainspring, making power generators. They had already showed that you can do it, so I had a role model of that. This is the obvious transition. But I think it really was the point in the engineering work where a ClearFlame engine is slightly more efficient than a regular diesel engine. And that's like a very academically interesting topic. But the big shift was, hey, it's not just a more efficient engine. It's an engine that can use a different fuel. It's not about being 3% more efficient. It's about having 50% or 100% less carbon because the fuel is cleaner.
Right.
And that much more fundamental step change, as opposed to the academic incremental improvement, is what made it much more of a business opportunity in our minds.
So give us the elevator pitch for ClearFlame today. What is the company, coming out of that research and into the real world? How would you define the company now?
Yeah, that the entire world is trying to figure out how to solve this climate problem that we've gotten ourselves into. Again, I mentioned that 40 billion tons of CO2 that we emit every year. The unfortunate reality, though, is that a lot of these emissions are coming from hard to electrify, low margin, commercially oriented sectors. Like EV is great, but it is not going to solve all of our problems. There are many applications where it's too expensive, where they can't do the duty cycles, where the infrastructure isn't there. If we're going to meet our climate goals in a way that is allowing us to continue to also improve global GDP and expand economies, we need to find a cost-effective way to decarbonize these assets. And that's what ClearFlame does. Rather than replacing a diesel truck with an EV, we modify that diesel truck or diesel gen so that the user is getting all the same experience they were before, with all the same behaviors that they were before. They're still using liquid fuels. It still works like a piece of diesel equipment, but it is something that is not only significantly lower in carbon, it's actually cheaper to operate. The fuels that we use are cheaper. And that's a huge differentiator for ClearFlame. We align better environmental outcomes with better economic outcomes. So rather than having to push against the challenges of maintaining companies' bottom line, we make it better for their bottom line to adopt ClearFlame and effectively harness the power of capitalism to scale our solution up, which, in my opinion, is just the fastest way to scale. Use the economic systems and the supply chains that already exist to make something as big as possible, as quickly as possible.
And you guys talk about it in terms of clear combustion technology. So how would you kind of define that for the layperson?
Yeah, so the reason why we're called ClearFlame, well, there's two reasons. One, the thesis advisor, Chris Francis Edwards, CFE, ClearFlame engines. So that was cute. That was Julie's idea, not mine. I can't take credit for it. But then also a clear flame, that orange color you associate with a candle flame, it's orange because of the soot, the black carbon that is in the flame. Whereas a soot-free, a clean-burning flame is clear. It looks a lot more like that natural gas stove, light blue color. And so the reason why we're ClearFlame is we use these fuels that are not only cheaper and lower in carbon, they're also low in things like soot. They're fundamentally clean burning and let us protect urban air quality, not just climate change. The way it works, the system's as dumb as, if you get it hot enough, anything burns. Of course, the devil's in the detail, but we basically create and do a lot of controls around a higher temperature combustion system so that we can burn these cleaner fuels that burn with a clear flame, but still delivering all the same performance parameters as diesel.
And give folks an example of what some of those fuels might be, just in practice.
Yeah, great question, because the technology is fundamentally fuel adaptive. The reason why I haven't said a fuel so far is because it really works on whatever makes sense in the market. Today, just because of what's out there, that's largely two things: ethanol and methanol. So ethanol, a biofuel that exists a lot in North and South America. Methanol, which you can make as a renewable hydrogen carrier, becoming much more common in Southeast, East Asia, some other areas like Chile, where ClearFlame has some investment money. Those two most predominantly. It works on fuels like ammonia, should they ever kind of become nationally deployed in the future. But ClearFlame, we don't view ourselves as having a dog in the which fuel is better fight. It's just simple. We go out in the market, you look at the fuel, tell me how much it costs, tell me what your effectively carbon reduction per dollar is, and I'll tell you what the best solution is in that market. And we are a receiver of that information rather than being beholden to one or the other.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the industry in general, and you kind of hinted at this, but walk us through, for folks who are not as familiar, like what are the big blockers to heavy duty engine technology in terms of decarbonization? Like, why isn't electrification a viable solution today for a lot of use cases like it might be for personal vehicles?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions out there in the market. Personal vehicles, EVs tend to work pretty well. Trucks, it's harder, but I think even it's a mistake to use a word like trucks. The market is so much more diverse than that. The thing that makes EV hard is really two things. Yes, batteries are expensive, but that, in my mind, that's actually a little less of it. That they're heavy, you just simply need a lot of them to get any meaningful amount of range. So if you are driving a long distance, that's a problem. A truck on the road in the US is limited to 80,000 pounds. If you have 10,000 pounds extra battery weight, then you actually have 10,000 pounds less payload you can pull. And if you're pulling like, Amazon boxes or Kleenex or potato chips, that's not a problem. But if you're pulling commodity, liquids or metals or hard assets, you can't tolerate that loss of payload. That's the first big thing. And the second is just the infrastructure that it takes to actually recharge these things. About 50 semi-trucks trying to recharge at a reasonable rate has the same power requirement of the Empire State Building. So imagine you're driving through, between two large cities, you pass those truck stops all up and down the freeway. Those on average have about 100 trucks at them or so. If we're saying we're going to electrify that, we're basically saying we're going to replace that truck stop with 2 Empire State Buildings and get the power there for it. That is a really hard problem. And so to go back to where EV is good, light loads, short ranges, even heavy loads in urban driving. So if you're pulling a load from the Port of Long Beach to the railhead, that makes sense. But open road, 100,000 plus miles a year, which is a huge fraction of the 4 million trucks that are already on the road today, a lot of those aren't going to be able to electrify, yet ClearFlame can turn them into something that does well and does good from the perspective of economics and the climate.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that the trends that I've heard from a lot of entrepreneurs, this idea of, we've got to start towards solutions immediately. Like, we don't need to find the perfect solution that we can execute on tomorrow, but we need to be making incremental improvements as much as possible going into the future to get to whatever ultimate steady state we need to get to for the benefit of the environment in general. And it feels like this is kind of the perfect example of that incremental step change. How do you think about that as like part of the scenario, in addition to thinking about ClearFlame and the technology as part of an aggregate permanent long-term solution for a more sustainable future as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a perfect example of that evolutionary change. I think what makes it such a good example is, evolutionary, if it evolves enough, eventually it does become revolutionary. Like there aren't that many of those step change examples of we replaced the horse and buggy with the Model T. That's kind of the canonical example of one of those step changes. But I mean, look at the evolution of computers over time. And in Moore's Law, that's just been constant improvement for decades. And so much of what we have today is not because of something revolutionary in terms of chip design, but just improvement of existing processes. Right. And that's what ClearFlame does. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You take everything that's good about the ecosystem today, domestic supply chains, maintenance support that already exists, cheap infrastructure, just change the one minimal piece you need about it, get rid of the diesel fuel, because that's the economic and environmental problem. And you can create a very big difference in value with a relatively minimal change. Now, the reason why that can become evolutionary, you're right, it's available today. And I don't push back at all when people call us a bridge technology, because we need bridge technology. We need things that could be a solution today. But it doesn't mean we're a bridge to nowhere. The fuels we use are decarbonizing faster than the electrical grid. We've already run carbon negative fuels in our engine, fuels that effectively have the impact of pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere as they're used because they're made from waste. We've already run those. If you have a pathway to net zero and ultimately net negative carbon emission, you're going to be relevant in this environment indefinitely. But with ClearFlame, you're not also sacrificing that near-term action as well.
Right. Wait, I want you to slow down and explain the carbon negative concept for folks. So that's really cool.
Yeah. So thank you for slowing me down. This comes from the fact that the impact of things like carbon, it's not like soot and smog. It's not like something that is emitted from a tailpipe and then whether or not you breathe it is what creates a problem. With carbon, it's a true life cycle impact. So when you look at an EV today, the impact of using an EV is not the zero emissions at the tailpipe. It is the fuels that were burned to create that electricity. If you're running an EV on coal power, it's not necessarily very good. Now, ClearFlame, the fuels that we use, some of them come from these biological sources, which aren't carbon negative, but about 50% better today. What would be something that is carbon negative? We've run fuels that are made from orchard wood waste. So California has big problems every summer with wildfires just because of wood waste that is around. And so to manage that, you have to either gather up that wood and put it in some pile to decompose where it releases a whole bunch of methane, or you incinerate it and it releases a whole bunch of soot. Either of those behaviors are worse than if you were just to take that feedstock, convert it into fuel, and use it in a ClearFlame engine. That's what negative means. The net environmental impact of using ClearFlame is actually lower than ClearFlame not existing at all. So it's better than net zero, which is that you're not making the world worse, that you're actually making carbon lower in the atmosphere by using your solution.
And let's go back to one thing you kind of hinted at earlier. So you've got a technology that has a series of applications that, at the very least are step change improvements on carbon emissions, and at the best take us to a carbon negative application. But you also said a few minutes ago, the value proposition you've realized is that folks have bought into is that this can get done from the user perspective, the consumer perspective, cheaper. Walk us through that value proposition. And as you talk to potential customers, how has that sales process gone? And how did you come to that realization?
Yeah. So the how it works is straightforward. The fuels we use are cheaper than diesel. The cost of owning a heavy duty truck over its lifetime, it's overwhelming the cost of the fuel that is used to operate the truck. And so by using a cheaper fuel, you make it cheaper to operate. Why that matters to customers, these are very thin margin sectors. We were talking to a fleet that's very interested in using ClearFlame, and we're kind of negotiating around the price point. And you're saying like, look, this route we're on, we have a 3% net profit margin on it. Like, I cannot pay more to use your technology. I cannot pay more to use any technology because it'll take me from in the black to in the red, like immediately.
Right.
Which is just not an option for some people. At the same time, while there are big climate goals out there, most people aren't paying a premium to move something sustainably. So if you're a fleet out there, you're a single digit margin company, doesn't matter whether you use an EV or ClearFlame or anything, if people aren't going to pay you more to do that, they'll give you your business, but they won't pay you more, then you have to find a way to win that business without it hurting your bottom line. And that's where ClearFlame comes in. Fleets are excited to use us because, we're slightly cheaper, or even in some cases, parity. They're still excited to use us because they get to go to their customers, the people that they ship for, and say, hey, look, I'm cutting your carbon in at least 50% today.
Yeah.
And we have a partnership with Gevo. They have a platform, Verity, that allows you to really track that carbon over the whole life cycle. We have the gold standard of carbon accounting that we can offer someone to sell to their customers without them needing to pay any more than it's costing them to move goods today.
Do you remember the first sale, that first conversation that got you a yes?
Oh, well, that's easy because it wasn't that long ago. So we've got 6 units on the road right now. We're building our 7th. But yeah, that was really kind of starting early this year, December last year, January this year, getting those first yeses. Now we're fully booked on the units we want to roll out in 2024. Still a modest number, an initial 10 to 12 more with customers, getting ready for kind of our limited production launch next year of 100. So yeah, no, I remember the first yes very well. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do at ClearFlame, but from a VC perspective, from an investor perspective, that is one of those step changes that you get as a business when you go from having an idea to having a product someone's willing to write a check for.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I think, I don't want to discount the psychological impact of having that validation, like someone outside of the organization with no vested interest saying, yeah, this is something I will purchase. What was that day like? What was that feeling like when you got the phone call or had the meeting when they said, yeah, we're in? I'm imagining it felt like winning a heat,
Actually, no, that's a very good way to put it, because I was always that way in swimming as well. It's okay, like you take that 5 seconds to be like, great, got that one done. Like I knew I was right about this, but now I have the proof. And so just like, I knew I could win this heat becomes I won that heat. I knew that the market wanted this product becomes the market does want this product. Like it is that empowering to go do what's next. It's very rare that you reach that end game and you're like, great, that was the last thing I wanted to do with my life, right? But this is the next thing that becomes that next incremental step. And it doesn't make it easier or harder, but now we've gone from proving this work and proves the market wants it, now to proving, and this is the stage we're now, that we can actually scale this up and get more and more interest. Yeah. And it is a momentary validation of what you've accomplished, but also a very invigorating push on taking ClearFlame to the next step, because it is the signal you can start making that transition.
How are you thinking about the scaling side of things?
A lot.
Constantly.
But I think the biggest thing with ClearFlame on our scaling is we want to stay very partner-oriented in the early part of our growth.
Yeah.
Everything about how you integrate this technology. Anytime I say we build or we modify an engine, it's not actually us. We contract manufacture that out to professionals that know how to build and rebuild and maintain diesel engine. So when I think of the near-term scaling, it's all about growing customer orders and growing partnerships to meet that demand. When I think about long-term, I believe very strongly that ClearFlame has the potential to be the Tesla of heavy duty. Like what made Tesla wasn't that they were just making an EV. It was that they saw a market need that the traditional incumbents did not and went out and they met that market need.
Right.
And then, in 2020 and 2021, people were trying to find the next Tesla. And there was, in my opinion, this erroneous sense that it was going to be a Tesla clone. No, it actually is the company that is figuring out what's around the next corner. That's ClearFlame. And that's where those orders on the previous question kind of come in, that we're showing what's around the corner. And we want to start licensing the technology to any OEM that wants to build this with us to meet this growing customer demand. Like 10 years from now, everyone's going to be talking about using decarbonized liquid fuels in heavy applications because ClearFlame proved it was possible, just like everyone's talking about using EVs today because Tesla proved it was possible.
And this may have the same answer, but I'm curious, not necessarily numerically, but just metaphorically, how you think about the total addressable market then?
A very good question. I mean, depending on who you ask and how you cut it, the total addressable market is massive. The market for transportation and diesel engines and off-road applications is $1 trillion market.
Right.
The way I think about the market is which fragments of that market are best for ClearFlame. And it's why I think of ClearFlame as really being complementary to EV. If you think of the engine market as a spectrum, and on one side you have the easy to electrify applications like passenger cars, the other side, the far end of really hard to electrify, that's not even semi-trucks. Those are things like ocean freighters and stuff like that. ClearFlame, we're focused on the hard to electrify into that spectrum, of which trucks are actually somewhere in the middle. The biggest thing I think about, my belief on how the market should be thinking about itself is this is not about pitting EV against ClearFlame. You have a whole bunch of different technologies. ClearFlame is one, EV is one, renewable diesel and hydrogen, those are all our ones as well. They're attacking different segments of this massive diesel market, which means there's plenty of business opportunity. And to tie that back to the environmental imperative that I think we need to be taking even more seriously than we already are, the fastest way you can do something about the carbon problem is start attacking it from a lot of different directions. You're opening up a multi-front war on carbon rather than just attacking it from the EV side.
Yeah. When you think about the market, but also your place in it, it does feel really robust as an opportunity. And so I would imagine and have seen proof that the funders in that space, the venture capitalists, seem like they agree. So I'm curious how conversations went as you thought about and began talking to the capital markets. The former banker in me will never leave. I love stories from a good roadshow. So what was that process like for you?
So we started ClearFlame in 2017. Clean tech and clean tech hardware especially was a dirty word from an investor perspective. And so we spent the first few years kind of getting off the ground using a lot of Department of Energy, National Science Foundation money. When we started taking our first venture capital, initially, clean energy ventures out of Boston, then companies or groups like Breakthrough Energy Ventures and Mercuria and many others adding. The funny thing that sort of evolved over time is investors actually have gotten more excited about ClearFlame after they're already in the company, which is something I'm really proud of. There's a lot of people that invest and they're like, gosh, this and that wasn't what I thought. I'd like to think of myself as not the oversell, under-deliver type. And I think the excitement of the company has grown, as has the market shifting back in our direction. When we got our seed investors, 2019, 2020, it was like, great, this is a 5 to 7 year play. We really got to build some OEM partnerships because everything's going to be EV by the end of that. Well, that was 2019, so we're already 5 years in. And now everyone's like, well, this is a 20 to 30 year play at the very least, if not longer than that. And so the ship continuing to move in our direction has been exciting. And I'm also excited that I think ClearFlame is very close to reaching a larger part of the capital markets. We're pretty close to being what I'd consider a boring company, making products that make money, that are scaling up, that are gross margin positive enough to be net profitable. And now the only question is, how can I work with the capital markets to scale as quickly as possible? I'm excited to be transitioning to that phase of the investor conversation.
I mean, one of the things I believed when I started this podcast, but really believe after a lot of these conversations that I've had, is the next generation of quote unquote unicorns will come from clean tech. They'll come from climate tech. Like, this is where not just the capital wants to be, but it's where the huge opportunities for business growth exist, I think.
Yeah, it has to be. Yeah. It is $1 trillion market that represents a 40 gigaton carbon problem. And if you're going to do something about the second half, then you're having a big advantage in $1 trillion market. That is something to get excited about.
And you talk early on that during the process in which you began your studies and kind of evolved into what you were passionate about, and then that evolved into ClearFlame, always beneath the surface was a recognition of the environmental challenges that we face now and the climate change challenge and opportunity. So, there's obviously the technology is built on making a positive impact, but I'm curious, like, as you think about the business in general, how you do think about aligning doing good and doing well.
Yeah, I think in a couple ways, one we talked about earlier, which is if you give a customer a choice between doing what's right by the planet and then doing what's right by their family, putting money on the table, everyone's going to choose the latter. And anyone who says they won't is
lying.
Probably not actually ever have been in that situation.
Yeah.
Giving people better economic outcomes by doing good is actually how you do more good.
Yes.
I think that also has been true in terms of how we thought about the investor base. Early on, especially in California, there's like, oh man, VCs, they've got this stigma. Like, is this better off as like a non-profit technology development firm? And I guess it kind of worked for OpenAI. But overwhelmingly, that's not how it works, right? The way you actually get scale for your solution is to get capitalism excited. And so by showing not just your customers, but the investors in you, hey, the more carbon we save means the more trucks we sold, which actually means the more return for you as an investor.
Right.
Like that is the power of that alignment between doing well and doing good.
Yeah, it's literally the idea of aligning the ROI for the planet with the profitability of the product.
Yeah. And like it or not, we live in a world where if those two things are at odds, it is not the ROI of the planet that's going to win. So we have to find a way to align the two.
One of the things I think is fun, you talk about the example of the waste wood in California, but I also think about like the example of ethanol. And we did a great event in Iowa and got to learn and experience a little bit about the ethanol economics in that community. It almost feels like this is like a little mini circular economy, right? Where you've got like a cleaner product using byproducts from a cleaner market. Like the whole thing is kind of circular in nature, which is kind of fun. I'm curious if that's something that was intentional and or there's other examples of that you kind of like to talk to.
Not intentional, but definitely very real. And I think it is probably the single best example of this. Like right now, we have a lot of agriculture products and a lot of fuels in this country, but those are all planted and harvested by diesel equipment. Tractors and combines run on diesel. The trucks that move goods around the country run on diesel. Part of the carbon intensity of ethanol, the reason why it's not a zero carbon solution, is because you do harvest it with diesel burning tractors and you do move goods around with diesel trucks. ClearFlame, by decarbonizing that, actually makes a virtuous cycle. By using our fuels in the production of the fuel, you actually make the fuel better. And you're also, I grew up in Seattle, went to school in California. Like I did not know I'd be doing a company that had something to do with ethanol, but like it is a fuel that really developed a bad name for a bunch of kind of weird political reasons. Some of it's true. Like, if you've heard ethanol's as bad as gasoline, that was probably true in the mid 90s when it was first getting started. Most technologies are bad when they're first getting started. It is one of the most scientifically studied fuels in terms of that 50% carbon reduction you get today, but also the innovation that goes into it. And it's not corn that is used for food. It is corn that we use for things like animal feed. So actually, animal feed is a byproduct of ethanol production process. When COVID happened, I didn't learn this until COVID, most of the fizz in soda, most of the CO2 in soda was captured from the ethanol production process. It's a very easy process to add carbon capture to. So when COVID happened and a lot of plants shut down, like the soda producers were like, crap, our Coca-Cola is flat. And so the way that it fits into this much bigger picture of being a low carbon pathway, not just for fuel, but for animal feed, for food grade CO2, all of that, in a way that is continuing to get better, in part because of ClearFlame and in part because of other innovations. It's a very exciting space to be right now.
The other thing I just want to touch on, Stanford graduate degrees aside, you and your co-founder, Julie, are a little bit unique in the startup space and I think offer a great example of diversity in clean tech and in particular kind of in the heavy industries. So I'm curious how you think about kind of diversity and the opportunity to really expand opportunities for founders, for entrepreneurs to follow in your footsteps.
Yeah, I think one of the things frustrating is that the data is absolutely there. I mean, this is true in business. They've done studies with Navy SEALs, like diverse teams function at a higher level, period. That's been shown over and over and over and over. I mean, it's still a challenge in VC and really capital dollars in general, getting diverse founders funded. Obviously, that has worked out for me because I've had people that were willing to believe in me, but it doesn't work out for everyone. And we still need more of that. I think my big pitch on diversity, though, is if you're trying to find the unicorns, like to your point earlier, the unicorns are not just going to be the nth iteration of the idea you've already seen. It's going to be the one that is a fundamentally new idea. And coming up with a new idea requires some sort of insight that has you looking at the market or the problem or the opportunity or the technology or something. You have to be looking at it in a different way in order to have that insight. And the way you look at the world is a function of your background. Diverse founding teams are going to look at problems differently. I don't think it's an accident that ClearFlame, Julie and I have thought about a technology that works in lower income areas, that works in developing economies, that work in the geographies that don't have the privilege of just throwing a whole bunch of capital at clean tech like we do here in the US.
Right.
And it is because of that different background and that different insight that gives us this bigger global opportunity that is also better for financial outcomes for investors.
Are there any other kind of big innovations or fields of research or companies that are doing cool things that you're following that you think others should be kind of keeping an eye on too?
I love all the innovations that are in the fuel space. I'll pick one that's kind of directly relevant for ClearFlame. Being a fuel adaptive solution, part of our message is stop worrying about synthesizing diesel fuel. Like, don't figure out how to make diesel from a renewable substance. Your focus, Shell, Chevron, BP, whoever, is to make a low carbon fuel as cost effectively as you can, and that'll work in our engine. And so, a lot of people are looking at green hydrogen today. If you're going to use hydrogen in mobile applications, you're better off turning it into e-methanol. Why would you use e-gasoline or e-diesel when you could use e-methanol? The e-methanol will be cheaper, and we can deliver the same performance. It's the same thing with the innovations I was talking about in the ethanol sector. The ethanol sector knows to be relevant, it's got to get to net zero for the grid, and it will, and people are investing in those solutions, investing in better fertilizers, companies like Pivot Bio that are eliminating the need for fertilizers entirely. This ecosystem we were talking about earlier, it is so much bigger than just ClearFlame in the trucks. It is all of the products and all of the carbon inputs into them and the work on better farming practices, on better engines, on better fuels. It's that whole picture coming together and moving at roughly the same pace so that we can have that rising tide effect.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about it.
Okay, last question. As a former athlete with an elite background, winning is important. And one of my big concerns, particularly with the narrative around climate change, is there's just a lot of negativity, a lot of bad headlines every day that I think sometimes shut people off to thinking about the possible or believing in the possible. And so I like to ask folks who are working in the space, leading companies in the space, motivating teams in the space, how do we defeat defeatism? How do we win and keep folks optimistic?
That's a great question. I mean, a few things. One, just to start with my soapbox comment, we got to stop telling kids that their future is going to be worse than ours. Like, that's an effed up thing to say to a child. And it's our job to not saddle them with that BS. But like you said, be a possibilist, be an opportunist to figure out what we can do about it. In terms of what we can do about it, this is where pointing to companies like ClearFlame is important. There are long-term battery technologies we need to be investing in. There is fusion that we need to be investing in, but we can do something about this problem today. Look at ClearFlame. ClearFlame is lower carbon per mile than an average EV today, while also cheaper than diesel. Like, if you have only heard the headlines, which are everywhere, about how we're falling behind on climate change, transportation emissions are still going up, and people aren't ready to adopt EVs, yeah, that's a pretty catastrophic sounding story. But when you find out, hey, actually there's another solution out there, unfortunately it doesn't meet the if it bleeds, it leads test. But I think that's where we need more amplification. It's why I appreciate the opportunity today that these solutions are out there. The best way to be a possibilist is to spend more time thinking about and observing what is already possible.
Yep. Yeah. There's so many, let me say it every day. The great thing about what I get to do with this podcast is I'm constantly blown away by the brilliant people working their asses off, the smart investors who are taking big bets. And if you spend enough time listening to these folks, these entrepreneurs, these investors, you realize that the firepower is there to turn the tide. So hopefully people do. Big thanks to BJ Johnson for joining us on Consensus in Conversation this week. Find out more about ClearFlame at clearflame.com, and we'll add links to their socials and more in the show notes. Also, check out their show notes on Spotify for this week's Q&A. We've really been enjoying all your answers, so make sure to weigh in. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, or ideas for future guests. We love your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. And it helps us to continue bringing you more awesome talks with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted and executive produced by me, Conor Gaughan. The episode was produced by Will Gatchell and Jeff Rock with editing from the good folks at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker, Greg Hergel on research, and Patrick Gallagher on strategy. Consensus in Conversation can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.